What if I told you that the true name and identity of the Almighty was erased from history on purpose? This question is not just any provocation. It is an invitation to spiritual awakening. Something profound has been hidden from you. Something so powerful, so transformative, that modern religions have chosen to silence it for centuries. Have you ever stopped to think, why does the God we are presented with always have a name, an image and an origin that bears no resemblance to the roots of Africa? Why were African cultures so spiritually rich, demonized and erased from sacred history? And what's more, why doesn't anyone talk about this in pulpits, in seminaries, in traditional churches? Today you are about to enter a territory that many avoid out of fear. Fear of losing power, of confronting the truth, of awakening souls that were asleep. Today's topic is clear, direct, and at the same time shrouded in mystery. Why did modern religions hide the African Most High? And this question goes far beyond skin color or geographic location. We are talking about a spiritual, historical, and intentional erasure, a silencing that shaped everything we know about faith, about God, about our spiritual identity. You were taught to worship a God that perhaps has nothing to do with your essence, your ancestry, your soul. And while many remain trapped in the images that were imposed during religious colonization, few dare to ask, what if the Creator I was introduced to is just a distorted version of the true Most High? That's what we're going to investigate together. Get ready, because this video is no ordinary lesson. It's a journey of liberation, a deconstruction. You will understand why the African Most High, the God of origins, of essence, of connection with the earth and with the spirit, was hidden, silenced, replaced. Let us reveal who this forgotten Almighty is. Let's delve into ignored scriptures, erased traditions, and stories that have never reached you. And above all, you will understand the impact this concealment has had on your faith, on your self-perception, on the way you connect with the divine. But first, I need to warn you, what you will hear here will contradict centuries of religious doctrine. It will break dogmas, it will shake structures, and it may even cause you discomfort. But the truth sets you free. And if you've come this far, it's because your spirit already senses that something isn't right. This is the time to open your spiritual eyes, to question what was taught, to remember what was forgotten, to recover what was taken. And don't think this is just about the past. This hidden truth has direct consequences on the present of your soul, and it could be the key to reconnecting with your true divine identity. Then, stay with me until the end of this video, because in the next revelations, you will understand who the African Most High really is and why so many are interested in keeping this secret under lock and key. And before we go any deeper into this investigation, let me make an important request of you. If something inside you is already making sense, if this message is awakening something inside you, comment below. I want to know. Have you ever felt that there was something wrong with the images and teachings you received about God? Have you ever wondered why there is so much silence about the African roots of faith? Your experience can enlighten others. This space is for this: reflection, discovery, reconnection. And look, if this video has touched you in any way, leave your like now. It may seem like just a click, but it helps this message reach more people who also need to wake up spiritually. And of course, subscribe to the channel. Here, with each new video, we work together to rebuild spirituality without colonial filters, exposing secrets and recovering what has been erased from history and from your soul. You are not here by chance. So participate, comment, share. The truth is revealing itself, and you are part of it. And to understand why modern religions have hidden the African Almighty, we need to go back in time. But not just to the story told in official books, which we already know are selective, but to the story that pulses in the ancestral memory of peoples. Because the truth, though silenced, still echoes in spiritual songs, in ancient rituals, in sacred names that have not been completely erased from the earth, only muffled. The great monotheistic religions, such as Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, emerged in historical contexts marked by territorial conflicts, expansionist empires, and a strong need for social control. It's no coincidence that as these religious systems consolidated, so did the marginalization, erasure, and even demonization of African spiritual traditions. Have you ever wondered why so many spiritual practices originating in Africa have been labeled pagan, primitive, or evil? This wasn't by chance. This label was intentional. It was a tool used by religious and political empires to justify conquests, colonizations, and dominations. Because to colonize a people's land, you must first colonize their faith. The African Almighty existed before modern religions. This needs to be stated clearly. Long before stone churches and religious councils, African peoples already recognized, revered, and worshipped the Supreme Creator in various forms, names, and manifestations. He was not a lesser god. He was not a tribal idol. He was the creative principle, the source of all existence, the one who rules the heavens and the earth. The name may change from region to region, Nzambi, Olodumare, Mawulisa, Ama, Mulungu, among others, but the essence is the same, a single, supreme God, present in all things. This spirituality was profound, integrated with nature, community, and ancestry. It was a sacredness not confined to temples, but revealed itself in trees, rivers, the sun, the silence of the night, and the birth of a child. This is why I made my digital book available, To Reveal the Apocalypse, which you can download immediately through the first comment set. This book will help you discover all the mysteries of the apocalypse and transform your life. Access the first comment set to get your copy, because very few remain and will soon be withdrawn. Don't waste time, click now and make sure your digital copy. And what happened when the colonizers arrived? They not only imposed weapons and chains, but also a new god, with a new name, a new image, a new language, and with that, they placed a veil over the African Most High. The creator, who was already known, was called by another name. He was replaced, and in many cases, he was portrayed as if he had never existed. The narrative of the one true God was fraught with exclusion. Ancestral faith was branded superstition. The African priest became a sorcerer. The oracle became a sin. The drum became a threat. And the Almighty became silence. But the question we need to ask is, who defined what is sacred? Who determined that God can only speak Hebrew, Greek, or Latin? Who decided that divine truth was limited to the walls of the Vatican, to European theological schools, to manipulated translations of Scripture? This is where the powerful and still little known concept of decolonized theologies comes in. And don't forget to get your digital book, Unraveling the Apocalypse. It is very important that you purchase it quickly before the copies run out. Decolonized theology is not about rejecting God. It's about rejecting the manipulated version of God that was used to dominate. It's about reclaiming stolen spirituality. It's about understanding that the Bible, for example, is not the property of Rome, Jerusalem, or Constantinople. It is also African. It was born in the hot soil of the Middle East, with deep roots in black cultures, in spiritual traditions that empires tried to erase. Decolonized theology leads us to ask uncomfortable yet liberating questions. For example, what if Moses, Joseph, the prophets, and the Messiah himself weren't white with blue eyes, but black with Afro-descendant features? What if the Promised Land bears more resemblance to the valleys of the Congo than to the halls of the Vatican? What if the Holy Spirit also speaks in Yoruba, Kimbundu, and Zulu, and not just in the European languages we've been taught to consider official? Understand? It's not just about ethnicity. It's about recognizing that the sacred is not the exclusive property of any culture, and that the Most High African has been silenced for convenience. Because a people who know their divine origin, who recognize the Creator within their own history, become uncontrollable. They rise up, they resist, they rebuild their faith authentically. And this, for religious systems of domination, is a threat. So the concealment of the African Most High was not a mistake. It was a strategy, one of the most effective in history, and perhaps the least challenged to date. But now the truth is emerging. Voices are being raised, forgotten manuscripts are being studied, ancient spiritual traditions are being revisited, not as folklore, but as legitimate sources of divine wisdom. And if you feel like this message is touching something deep within you, perhaps it's because this truth was already there, dormant, waiting to be awakened. The voice of the Most High African still echoes. And perhaps that's why you've come this far. If this makes sense to you, write in the comments, the African Most High will no longer be silenced. Or else, my faith begins with my ancestry. You can even comment with just the emoji if you're still processing everything, but you want to show that you're here, that you're awake, that you're connected. And if you feel this video needs to reach more people, share it. There are people who have never heard this, but who need to. And you can be the instrument of this reconnection. Now take a deep breath, because what we're about to reveal in the next part will shatter even deeper structures. And now that we've opened the door to this reconnection with ancestral spirituality, it's time to face one of the most important and also most forgotten questions of faith. What is the true name of the Almighty? Not the imposed name, not the translated name, but the name pronounced by our ancestors before religious institutions rewrote everything. Because names convey identity, names invoke presence, names reveal spiritual essence, and hiding the Creator's true name is a subtle but extremely effective way of erasing the bond between the people and their God. And that's exactly what happened. You'll recall that in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, God is called by names like Elohim, El Shaddai, Adonai, and the most familiar of all, YHWH, which many Western traditions pronounce as Yahweh or Jehovah. But did these names arise out of nowhere? Were they exclusive to the Hebrew people? Or could it be that these sounds, these syllables, these invocations had long been echoing among African peoples? What almost no one tells you, and many don't want you to know, is that the name Yah was already used by African peoples long before the Bible was written. That's right. Peoples of Central and West Africa, in their oral liturgies, already invoke the Almighty with sounds similar to Yah, Iya, or even Ayo. And not only that, they also recognize this God as supreme, invisible, creator of heaven and earth, exactly as described in Scripture. In the Bantu tradition, for example, we have the name Nzambi, a powerful name, full of spiritual weight, used to refer to the creator of all that exists. Nzambi is not a tribal god, nor a lesser spirit. He is the supreme being, the Most High, the source of all existence. This name was and still is revered in communities in Congo, Angola, and other regions of the African continent. Among the Yoruba, the name Olodumare is sacred. He represents the omnipotent, omniscient, unattainable, and perfect God. Olodumare is undivided, unimaged, and has no human form. He is pure creative energy, light, truth, and justice. Olodumare is the supreme force that governs the universe, and it is through him that all things were created. The Fon people of Benin revere Mawu Lisa, who represents the dual aspect of the divine. Mawu, the feminine principle, and Lisa, the masculine principle. Together, they reveal a complete vision of the Almighty, without separation, without fragmentation, but as a harmonious whole. Now pay attention to this. All these names, Nzambi, Olodumare, Maulisa, Yah, point to the same God you find in Scripture. But why then have these names been erased, excluded, replaced? Why, instead of bringing people closer to faith, have institutionalized religions created a wall between the Creator and His children, as if only one language, one culture, one theology had access to truth? The answer may be harsh, but it's real. Recognizing these names would be admitting that divine revelation was not exclusive to one people, one religion, or one book. It would be admitting that God already manifested Himself in Africa, among black peoples, long before the arrival of European missionaries. It would be giving voice to the drums, the chants, the sacred names that were buried under centuries of religious imposition. And if you pay close attention, you'll notice something even more revealing. Biblical names carry phonetic and spiritual roots that connect with these African names. The Yah in Yahweh echoes the Iya in the oral invocations of various African ethnic groups. The title of El Elyon, God Most High, is paralleled in the concept of Nzambi Mpungu, the invisible Most High who dwells on high, in the Bantu worldview. Modern theology rarely makes these connections, and when it does, it's superficial, without delving into the depths of what this means spiritually. Because if people discover that God already spoke to their people before colonization, if they discover that the Bible is not European property, but a book with African roots as well, everything changes. The system of religious control loses its power, and human beings return to seeking truth within themselves and their ancestry. And here I want to invite you to reflect on something very personal. What do you call your God? Does this name carry the weight of your story? Does this name bring you closer or further away from your spiritual essence? There's no problem with using familiar names. The problem is denying or disregarding the old names, the original names, the names that echoed long before the colonization of faith. Because these names have power. They are portals. They carry centuries of devotion, wisdom, and a deep connection with the sacred. And if the name is one of the purest forms of invocation, then to reclaim the original name of the Almighty is to reclaim part of our soul. It is to reconnect the lost link between creator and creature. It is to declare with awareness, I know who I am, I know where I came from, and I know who created me. Perhaps now you'll begin to understand why modern religions have chosen to hide these names. Because by keeping people ignorant of the origins of the sacred, it becomes easier to control. It becomes easier to manipulate. It becomes easier to erase the spiritual identity of entire generations. But that time is running out. The curtain is falling, and the ancient voices, which once echoed in erased languages, are beginning to resurface with strength, with fire, with truth. If this part touched you, comment below, God live, or write, the name of the Most High will not be forgotten. Or you can also write the name you connect with the most. Nzambi, Olodumare, Yah, Maulisa. Let's reclaim these sacred names together. Let's strengthen the spiritual memory that runs through our veins. Leave your comment. Keep that flame burning, because what comes next will take this revelation to a new level. Now that we begin to remember the names of the Almighty in African traditions, we need to understand why, after all, these names have been so forcefully and persistently hidden. Why don't we hear about Nzambi, Olodumare, Maulisa in church sermons, theological books, or religious formation courses? The answer lies in a word that has shaped centuries of faith: power. Spirituality, when free and rooted in consciousness, is a force too powerful to be tamed. It awakens human beings, connecting them with their origins, their identity, and their purpose. But when this spirituality is channeled and shaped by institutions, it ceases to be a path to freedom and becomes an instrument of control. That's exactly what happened. For centuries, religion and political power have gone hand in hand. not as a pure expression of faith, but as a strategic tool to control entire populations, redefine histories, destroy cultures, and impose a single way of thinking about the divine. And it's important for you to understand this. The concealment of the African Almighty was not just a consequence of racism, but a theological, social, and geopolitical strategy. When empires began to expand their domains, they knew it wasn't enough to conquer territories with swords and armies. They also needed to conquer the minds, hearts, and above all, the faith of the people. And how do you do that? By erasing the original God and replacing him with another. A God with a name, face, language, and culture completely different from your own. It was in this context that images of a European god emerged. White, stern, distant, enthroned in celestial palaces, a direct reflection of Earth's monarchies. A god who demanded blind obedience, submission, and fear. A god who legitimized kingdoms, justified wars, and accepted slavery as part of a divine plan. Yes, a god created to maintain the order of the system. But think with me. What similarity exists between this God created by empires and the African Almighty, intimate, present, integrated into daily life, celebrated in music, dance, and communion with nature? They are two completely opposite concepts. And it was no coincidence that the latter was silenced. The institutionalized church, over the centuries, not only reinterpreted scripture, it rewrote entire narratives. Councils, translations, censorships, and doctrines were shaped by human hands, always according to the interests of those in power. Many passages were removed, others added, and almost all cosmologies that harked back to African, Semitic, and Eastern traditions were rejected. At the same time, African spiritual traditions were under attack from all sides. Millennial cults were classified as idolatry. Healing practices that had been passed down from generation to generation were called witchcraft. Entire philosophical systems, such as those that existed in ancient Egypt, Aksum, and If, were treated as mythology or superstition. The saddest thing is that this manipulation was so profound that many of the descendants of these peoples began to reject the roots of their spirituality. They were taught to feel ashamed of their own divine heritage, to believe that everything that came from Africa was inferior, sinful, and demonic, that God lived in Rome, spoke Latin, and only recognized the doctrines of the official church. This process was devastating. It disconnected millions of souls from their origins. It created a spiritual void that many still carry to this day, even within churches. People who pray, fast, and praise, but feel something is missing, something essential, something they can't name, but which screams within them, "You're worshipping a reflection, not the essence." And that's why so many people, when they reconnect with ancestral traditions, feel relief, a peace, an awakening. Because something finally clicks. The image of the Almighty makes sense again. The sacred ceases to be an imposition and becomes communion again. Spirituality then ceases to be fear, guilt, and penance, and transforms into love, truth, and freedom. But it takes courage to make this journey back, because the dominant religious system has been trained to keep you away from this truth. It will say it's heresy, syncretism, deviation. But if you listen with the ears of the Spirit, you will realize that this reconnection with the African Almighty doesn't deny God. It brings you closer to Him than you've ever been before. And at this point in the journey, you can already see the erasure of African cosmologies was no accident. It was a silent, strategic, systematic operation, because these cosmologies conveyed a worldview that was not in the interests of the dominant power, a vision where the sacred is not confined to temples, but lives in the body, in the land, in time, in the collective. Do you realize how transformative this is? In the African spiritual vision, God is not distant, unreachable. He is here, Now, within you, he manifests himself in the sound of a drum, in the scent of wet earth, in the embrace of an elder, in the birth of a child. He does not need to be mediated by religious hierarchies because he walks with the people, feels their pain, weeps, and celebrates with them. This living, breathing, real theology was silenced so that the empire could prosper. But she's coming back. And if you're here watching this far, it's because something in you is also awakening. Something that perhaps even you can't explain, but that pulses ever stronger within your soul. So, if this truth is vibrating inside you, comment below, "I reject spiritual manipulation." Or write, "The image of the Most High will no longer be distorted." You can also just write, "I return to my roots," if you want to be more direct. These words are seeds. And each comment of yours strengthens this movement of reconnection, healing, and truth. Stay with me, because what we'll reveal in the next part will give you tools to identify where, when, and how these distortions were implanted, and how to free your faith from it all. If it's clear so far how religious manipulation was used to disconnect people from their ancestral spirituality, now we must face head-on what is perhaps the most subtle and, at the same time, most brutal blow of all: the reshaping of the image of God himself. Yes, the image of the Almighty was modified, whitewashed, standardized. And it wasn't just an aesthetic alteration, it was a theological project of domination. Because you see, when you alter the appearance of the sacred, you also alter the identity of those who worship it. The way we see God shapes the way we see ourselves. And if the God you were taught to worship has fair skin, European features, blue eyes, straight hair, a completely different appearance from yours, what does this image silently communicate to your subconscious? The message is simple yet devastating. Everything sacred looks like them, and everything that looks like you doesn't. Eurocentric supremacy wasn't content simply to rewrite spiritual narratives. It needed to create a symbolic image to support this distorted theology. Thus, for centuries, God was depicted as a white, bearded man seated on a heavenly throne, an image that doesn't exist in any original sacred text, but which has been propagated to the point of becoming the only possible one in the minds of millions. And it didn't stop there. The figure of Jesus, the angels, the prophets, the saints, all were transformed. Medieval and Renaissance Christian iconography consolidated a divine aesthetic based on whiteness as a symbol of purity, holiness, and power. And along with this, dark skin became associated with ignorance, sin, error, and evil. This wasn't an artistic coincidence. This was visual doctrine. It was spiritual psychology being weaponized. Because if the sacred has a white face, everything that deviates from this image is seen as inferior, devoid of light, unworthy of worship. And this is exactly how millions of black people have come to see themselves in the mirror, even without ever being aware of why. Consider the impact this has on a black child, growing up within a religion where all sacred beings are white, where good has a European face and evil has horns, dark skin, and a monstrous appearance, where God is in Rome, in the Vatican, in Michelangelo's paintings, but never in Angola, the Congo, Ghana, or Ethiopia. What does this child learn about themselves, about their people, about the possibility of being loved and chosen by God? This is the poison of the theological error of Eurocentric supremacy. It doesn't need to be taught directly. It is absorbed through the eyes. It enters silently, shaping beliefs, identities, self-esteem, and faith. It creates a spiritual void that no memorized prayer can fill, because the heart has already been programmed to believe that its image is unworthy of heaven. And the most tragic thing is that this continues to be reproduced today. Packed churches, but empty hearts. Moving services, but colonized consciences. People who love God, but reject themselves every time they look in the mirror. who repeat verses but carry within themselves the feeling that there is an invisible, almost insurmountable distance between their appearance and the appearance of the one they were taught as the Son of God. Eurocentric supremacy not only distorted the image of God, it hijacked the spiritual identity of an entire people. And in doing so, it perpetuated a cycle of inferiority disguised as faith. Millions of people kneel every day before an image that excludes them, that doesn't resemble them, that doesn't represent them, yet they still believe this is the only possible way to please the Almighty. But would the Creator, who created all races, cultures, and colors, have only one acceptable visible form? Would the God of creation, the source of diversity, accept being reduced to a single appearance, the very appearance of those who have historically dominated, enslaved, and imposed their faith with blood and sword? This is not only incoherent, it is blasphemy against the very spirit of truth. And that is why the recovery of the divine image must happen, not as a project of ethnic revenge, but as an act of spiritual justice. Because if we were made in the image and likeness of the Creator, then any unique and exclusive representation of God is a denial of our existence. And here's the key. It's not about transforming God into a black man. It's about breaking with the need to limit him to any human image. But as long as divine representations are restricted to European aesthetics, reparation demands that blackness also have the right to see itself in the sacred, to see itself in heaven, to recognize itself on the throne. This rescue is not vanity, it is healing. It is liberation. It is a reconnection with a spirituality that restores our dignity, honor, and the awareness that we were never far from God. We were only separated from the truth. And now that you're seeing it with new eyes, notice how all of this connects to what we've discussed so far. The hidden name, the silenced faith, the demonized cosmologies, and now the distorted image. This wasn't an isolated action. It was a project, and the deeper we delve, the clearer it becomes. The goal has always been the same, to make you forget who you are and who your Creator is. But you're here, watching, listening, feeling. This is already a sign. The image is fading. The fog is dissipating. The presence of the Almighty is revealing itself again, but now in its purest form, free of filters, paintings, and imposed standards. Because God never needed a portrait. He was always within you. If this excerpt touched something inside you, comment below, "My image reflects the sacred," or write, "I reject the distortion of God's image." If you want, you can leave just one to show that you are awake, conscious, and present on this journey. Every comment you leave here is a building block in the rebuilding of our spirituality. So write, share what you felt. Let's get this message where it needs to go. And get ready, because the next step will be even deeper. We have reached a part of the path where the words may even tremble in the mouth of those who say them. Because now we are going to touch on what is perhaps the most glaring, most strategic, most blatant omission, and yet invisible in this entire story, the biblical evidence that points to the African roots of the Hebrews and the patriarchs of the faith. Yes, you heard right. The Bible itself, the book most widely used by modern churches, is replete with clues, descriptions, geographical connections, and lineages that point to the fact that the early Hebrews were dark-skinned people, similar to African descendants, and with origins deeply tied to the African continent. And the most striking thing is to realize that this isn't hidden. It's written. It's there. It's always been there. But it's been ignored, omitted, camouflaged under convenient interpretations and translations. That is why we need to ask, why is this not taught in modern churches? Why in so many years of teaching, preaching, theology, and pastoral formation, does almost no one mention the connections between the patriarchs of the faith and the lands of Ethiopia, Egypt, Cush, and Canaan, all located on the Afro-Asian axis. Why are the Hebrews portrayed as Europeans when biblical geography itself places them in the heart of the Black and Semitic world? Let's start with the most basic. Abraham, the so-called father of faith. He came from the land of Ur of the Chaldeans, located in ancient Mesopotamia, present-day Iraq, a region that directly bordered African civilizations and interconnected with the trade and cultural roots of Black and Afro-Asian peoples. The Bible says he went down to Egypt during a famine, and there he was mistaken for part of the local people. Think about it. If Abraham had had such different features from the Egyptians, this wouldn't have happened. But it did. Later, his grandson Jacob also went to Egypt with his sons, including Joseph, who became governor of that land. And the most curious thing is that Joseph's brothers, upon meeting him again years later, didn't recognize him among the Egyptians. In other words, Joseph resembled them. His appearance didn't stand out. He wasn't visibly foreign. This alone should be enough to question the popular image of the Hebrews as white or European. Now consider Moses, raised in the Pharaoh's court as an Egyptian. Moses, a Hebrew, was raised as part of the African elite. He was also identified as Hebrew only by revelation and behavior, never by appearance. This would only be possible if he shared the same skin tone and physical characteristics as the Egyptian people of the time, that is, black people. The Bible also mentions that Moses married a Cushite woman. Cush was an African region south of Egypt, known today as Sudan and parts of Ethiopia. It was a black, dark-skinned kingdom. So much so that when Miriam, Moses' sister, criticized his marriage to the Cushite woman, she was severely punished by God with leprosy, and her skin turned white as snow. This is not symbolic, it is literal. The contrast here is a clear affirmation of the blackness of Moses' wife and of divine approval of this union. Let's continue. Solomon, Israel's wisest king, had direct connections with Africa. The visit of the Queen of Sheba, a powerful African woman, ruler of Ethiopia, is narrated with admiration. According to some traditions, they produced descendants who became kings of Ethiopia, beginning a spiritual and political lineage that endured for centuries. And what about Jesus? Born in Judea, he was hidden in Egypt as a child to escape Herod's persecution. If Jesus had a European appearance, how could he have hidden among the Egyptians unnoticed? This is never questioned because many don't want to confront the obvious truth. The people of the Bible were more similar to Africans than to the Europeans who portrayed them centuries later. The Bible speaks of Ethiopia, Egypt, Libya, Cush, and Seba with reverence. These nations are present from Genesis to Revelation, and not as supporting characters, but as peoples with a spiritual destiny, covenants with God, a prophetic role, and an active presence in sacred history. So the question needs to be asked again: why is this not taught in modern churches? Because accepting this reality would be to confront the theological racism that sustained centuries of spiritual colonization. It would be to admit that the original Hebrews were black, that Christ's lineage is marked by Afro-Asian admixtures, that God's people do not resemble the paintings of the European Renaissance, but rather the peoples of Africa, the Middle East, south of the Sahara, and the banks of the Nile. And this recognition would change everything. It would heal the spiritual self-esteem of millions of black people who feel distant from God because they don't resemble the images they've learned to associate with the sacred. It would dismantle the theological system that still insists between the lines that God prefers a people with a European face. It would restore dignity, ancestry, and identity to those who have been taught to kneel before a faith that has never fully acknowledged them. But the good news is that this truth is emerging. It's coming to light. It's permeating generations with a force that can no longer be silenced. People are reading the Bible with decolonized eyes, listening to the voices hidden between the lines, recognizing the signs that have been ignored for so long. And now you see it too. You see that the blood of ancient Hebrews runs in the same veins that built African civilizations. You understand that the faith you were taught to see as imported may, in fact, have originated with your own people. That the African Almighty is not an invention. It is a truth that has been before our eyes all along, waiting to be rediscovered. If this part of the video revealed something to you that no one else had ever told you, comment below. The Bible speaks of Africa, and Africa speaks to God. Or else, the original Hebrews were black, and that matters. If you want to be direct, write, "Now I see." Every comment helps spread this truth, helps open the eyes of those still trapped in the narrative that has erased our spiritual history. And stay with me, because what follows will show why so many spiritual leaders still avoid this subject, and what happens when truth knocks on the door of institutionalized religion. We have now reached a point in our journey where many prefer to stop, a territory where silence speaks louder than any sermon, where the emptiness between the lines of sermons reveals more than 1,000 words. Because if everything we've discussed so far is written, documented, recorded in sacred texts, revealed in historical evidence, witnessed by living traditions, then why do modern churches avoid this subject as if it were a forbidden heresy? Why don't pastors, priests, bishops, and spiritual leaders, men and women who claim to be guided by truth, touch on this topic? Why is it so rare to hear a sermon that clearly states the original Hebrews were black? That speaks of Nzambi, Olodumare, and Mabulisa, not as myths, but as sacred expressions of the Almighty. That acknowledges that the African people were not only evangelized, but before that, they already knew the Creator in their own languages, rhythms, and cosmologies. This silence isn't a lack of information. Today, anyone with a Bible in hand, a little discernment, and a willingness to research can perceive that there's something hidden behind the doctrines that have been piled one upon the other over the centuries. Silence is, in fact, a strategy for preserving the system, because this system knows, and has always known, that when the identity of the Almighty is restored, religious control begins to crumble. And here's the tricky point. Many spiritual leaders aren't afraid of the lie being exposed. They're afraid of the truth setting free. Because the truth that sets free also removes pedestals, dismantles hierarchies, questions structures, returns power to the people, and forces the clergy to look in the mirror and recognize that much of what they preach comes not from divine revelation, but from human tradition. And when the truth arrives, it demands a stance. There's no longer room for fence-sitting, nor for hiding behind convenient interpretations. Those with a conscience must choose between maintaining appearances or honoring the spirit. And unfortunately, many choose appearances. They choose the security of liturgical routine, the stability of guaranteed tithing, the reverence of a congregation that prefers to remain blind rather than deconstruct what it has believed for decades. But the truth can no longer be contained. The spirit of truth is blowing. It's touching hearts outside the temples. It's raising up men and women who have never been to seminaries, but whose eyes are open and their hearts are burning. People who have heard the voice of the Almighty beyond the walls of religion. People who understand that God dwells not only in the pulpit, but also in the streets, in the favelas, in the forests, in the terreiros, in the black communities that have been rejected by official theology. And when this truth touches a life, everything changes. Because reclaiming the identity of the Almighty is not just a theological act, it is a spiritual, ancestral, and revolutionary reunion. When a black person discovers that they are not serving an imported God, but reconnecting with the Creator their ancestors already knew, the effect is profound. Faith ceases to be submission and becomes empowerment. Worship ceases to be performance and becomes truth. prayer becomes a reconnection with one's own essence. That's why the church's silence is so heavy. Because it's not just a mission, it's complicity with the colonial structure, with the distortion of the divine image, with the erasure of ancestral faith, with the perverse idea that there is a chosen people with a European face, while the rest need only obey, serve, and accept without question. But what happens when this cycle breaks? When a son or daughter of the African diaspora lifts their head, looks to the sky and says, "I know my God, and he looks like me." When one reopens the sacred texts, but now with decolonized eyes, and realizes that Ethiopia was always there, that the kings of Kush were always there, that the black bloodlines were always part of the divine plan, and that we were deceived into believing they were not, what happens is awakening, liberation, the resurrection of faith. And this is frightening, because people freed from spiritual alienation no longer bow so easily. They no longer swallow any dogma. They no longer accept leaders who preach arrogantly but hide essential truths. They no longer allow themselves to be manipulated by theologies that ignore their pain, their history, their identity. And more than that, these people begin to teach, to lift others up, to ignite minds and hearts with a living, rooted, vibrant faith. A faith that doesn't ask permission from tradition, because it is older than it. A faith that comes from the clay of creation, from the memory of ancestors, from the revelation of the Almighty Himself, who has never stopped speaking, only been drowned out by louder voices. Therefore, the silence of modern churches screams. It screams in every service where the topic is avoided. It screams in every theological school that teaches Eurocentric dogmas as if they were absolute. It screams in every pastor who remains silent for fear of losing the pulpit, his position, his influence. And the more this silence tries to impose itself, the more unsustainable it becomes, because the Spirit is already moving, and He will not stop. If you feel this, if you realize that this revelation is burning within you, even without knowing exactly how to explain it, then you are already part of this movement. Don't wait for the institutional church's approval to believe what the Almighty is showing you, because those who remain silent in the face of truth become accomplices to lies, and those who stand up for the truth, even amid the silence of the religious, become a prophetic voice for their generation. If this part gave you courage, comment below. The silence of the churches will not silence me. Or else, the truth of the Most High speaks louder. If you want, write, "I listened." Leave your comment and strengthen this spiritual awakening network. Because when many rise up together, not even the heaviest silence can stop us. Stay with me, because in the next section, we'll understand how to resume this spiritual path with clarity, awareness, and direction. Now that the silence is broken, what begins to emerge from the ashes is something no institutionalized structure can contain: the restoration of spiritual truth. Not the kind of truth molded by theological conveniences, nor the kind diluted in rigid doctrines, but the living truth which pulses in the heart of those who finally reconnect with what they carried in their spirit even before they had a name to call it. And what's happening now in many parts of the world is a subtle and powerful movement. Black men and women awakening to the spiritual ancestry that for centuries was stifled. People who grew up hearing that God could only be accessed through a European model of faith now hear, for the first time, the beat of drums echoing within their hearts, not as a noise from the past, but as a living call from the present. These are people who, after years inside temples that didn't connect with their reality, finally understood that faith doesn't have to be a prison, that there's no conflict between spirituality and ancestry. That reclaiming African roots isn't rejecting faith, it's rediscovering it. And when this happens, something profound is healed, something that was wounded, silent, dormant, rises with strength, with truth, with awareness. I want to tell you something that's happening slowly but steadily. Ordinary people who've never heard of theological decolonization are beginning to ask questions that break decades of silence. They ask why they've never heard of Cush from the pulpit, why Ethiopia is mentioned in the Bible with such reverence, yet ignored in biblical studies, why the patriarchs resembled the Egyptians, and most importantly, why they've never been told that God also spoke in the languages of their ancestors. These questions don't arise by chance. They are signs that truth is returning to its place. And what's most moving is seeing how this transforms the identity of those who awaken. Because when a person realizes that their color, their history, their people, their culture, all of this was already part of the spiritual plane, they stop asking permission to exist within faith. They recognize themselves. They accept themselves. They reconnect. This reconnection even changes the way we pray. It changes the way we look to the heavens. It changes the tone of our voice when we speak to the Almighty. Because now prayer no longer comes from a place of fear, nor of subservience to an imposed image. Now it comes from a place of covenant, of awareness, of true intimacy. The person returns to speaking with God as an equal, as if rediscovering a father who never abandoned them, but was distorted in the translation. And in this process of restoration, many people are discovering that the Bible, when read without Eurocentric lenses, reveals a pulsating, present, and sacred African spirituality. After all, the biblical narrative itself begins on the African continent. Genesis mentions the Nile River, the land of Cush, Ethiopia, and the regions where Noah's sons settled. And throughout the sacred text, we see the active presence of characters, peoples, and events deeply connected to Africa. But what few people realize is that African spirituality is also present in the symbols, rituals, and spiritual languages that were absorbed by the Hebrew tradition. The appreciation of natural cycles, the wisdom of the elders, the use of natural elements in rituals, music as an instrument of divine connection, all these are characteristics that are also part of the ancestral African spiritual experience. When this bridge is rebuilt, much realigns within the soul. It's as if, for the first time, you're allowed to exist fully within faith, no longer divided between what you feel and what you've been told is right. No longer trapped between the Bible and your ancestors, but whole, total, aligned, with roots and wings, with memory and direction. And that's why this spiritual restoration is so powerful, because it doesn't come from above, it's not imposed, it's born from within. It's lived in practice. It begins when someone hears a new, or perhaps old, truth, and something ignites inside. And that light never goes out. Because, unlike institutional religion, which needs rules to maintain control, spiritual truth doesn't need fences. It just needs to be felt. I've seen people who carried years of spiritual confusion find peace in discovering that their people were not outside the story of salvation, that their culture was not sin, that their features, their hair, their skin, their rhythms were not obstacles to the divine, but expressions of the divine itself. I've seen people who rejected everything that came from Africa, out of fear, indoctrination, or ignorance, reconcile with their origins and say, "Now I understand, now I feel, now I am whole." This isn't theory. This is restoration. This is deep healing, and that's within your reach too. You don't have to abandon everything you've learned, but you do need to learn to question, to dig deeper, to listen to what your soul has been trying to tell you for so long. Because if you've come this far, it wasn't by chance. The Almighty is calling you back, not to the religion of the oppressor, but to the spirituality of your ancestors, to the place where faith and identity are inseparable, where God speaks your language, where the sky has no color but recognizes your face. This is the beauty of the restoration of spiritual truth. It doesn't force you into anything, but it frees you from everything that has separated you from your essence. And the more you allow yourself to feel, the clearer it becomes. There is no separation between who you are and who created you. If you felt this way, comment below. I am reconnecting with my spiritual ancestry. Or write, my faith has roots. Or even, the Almighty has known me since before colonization. Leave your comment, share what this awakened in you, and strengthen this movement of deep reconnection that is happening in many souls, including yours. Because the journey isn't over yet. And what comes next will reveal how to walk this path firmly, fearlessly, and with spiritual clarity. Now I want you to take a deep breath and feel what's coming. Because what I'm going to tell you is no longer an explanation, no longer historical or biblical data, no longer an external exposition. It's an invitation to go within, into yourself, into your history, your memory, your soul. After everything we've been through so far, I ask you with sincerity and respect, what does this truth mean to you? What changes within your heart when you realize that the Creator, the Almighty, was not revealed exclusively through the lenses of a continent, a culture, a Eurocentric theology, but rather that He also revealed Himself powerfully through African cosmologies, Black languages, the ways of your ancestors? Have you, without realizing it, spent your entire life worshipping an image that does not represent the true Creator? Could it be that deep down, the spiritual void you feel, the one that no service, no music, no preacher has been able to fill, has to do with the absence of truth in the way you were taught to connect with God? Because you see, what has been called faith in many places isn't faith, it's conditioning, it's repetition, it's fear-based indoctrination, it's worship of an image constructed by historical and political interests, not by divine revelation. And when you wake up to that, there's no going back to sleep. You begin to realize that over time, you've been forced to swallow a spirituality without identity, a cult without roots, a faith that required you to deny yourself to be accepted, that required you to hide your origins, reject your symbols, doubt your ancestry, all in the name of a God that didn't even fully recognize you. And now the Spirit asks you, do you still want to continue relating to a distorted reflection? Or are you ready to rediscover the truth of the Almighty who has always walked with you even when you didn't know His name? Because this emptiness so many feel today, this weariness of the soul, this anguish that no religion can resolve, comes from the disconnect between who you are and who you were told you should be to be accepted by God. And what's happening right now as you watch, listen, and feel is a rapprochement, a spiritual reconnection with the truth that the system has hidden, but that the Spirit is revealing. You may think you've always had faith, but have you ever had spiritual freedom? You may think you've always prayed sincerely, but have you ever prayed consciously? Was your worship spontaneous or formatted? Was your view of God inspired by the Spirit or imposed by colonization? And most importantly, does this image of God you've learned to revere really represent who He is, or just who the powers that be wanted Him to be? Believe me, this question is not offensive. It is necessary. It is urgent. It is the beginning of a deep healing. Because only when we question courageously do we find true answers. And perhaps, for the first time, you're realizing that it wasn't the Creator who distanced Himself from you. It was your mistaken image of Him that kept you away. And don't feel guilty about it. It was never your fault. You inherited a faith that was already distorted. You received a Bible already translated through a limited lens. You entered churches that had already removed the dark traces of spirituality. But now you are having access to what was denied to you. And that changes everything. Because recovering the identity of the Most High is not just an act of knowledge. It is an act of reconciliation. It's recognizing that the Creator never rejected you. He was rejected through the wrong image they placed in His place. And when that image falls, what remains is the pure gaze of truth staring back at you. and you feel it. You feel it because it's real. Feel because this truth does not pass through the intellect. It passes through the soul. It stirs memories you never knew you had. It activates something dormant within you. It reconnects you with an ancestral knowledge that was silenced but never dead. And when you reconnect with that truth, your prayer changes. His gaze changes. Your way of walking through life changes. You no longer have to force a faith that doesn't make sense. You begin to live a spirituality that is part of who you are. And that's why I ask you again, not with words, but with presence. What is this truth doing inside you now? Feel, listen, allow the Spirit to speak. And if you felt it, comment below. But he doesn't comment just for the sake of commenting. He comments as a prophetic act, like a mark on the path, like a stone on the altar of your spiritual memory. He writes, "The image fell and the truth appeared." Or comment, "My faith will no longer be manipulated." Or simply, "I have returned to the Most High." Whatever your expression, leave it here, because this journey is personal, but it is also collective. And each comment of yours could be the confirmation that someone else needed to also wake up. Now get ready, because the next step is to understand how to walk with this truth without fear, without guilt, and without turning back. If you've come this far, it's because this message spoke to your soul. And that already says a lot about who you are and what the Almighty is doing in your life. Now I make you an invitation. Subscribe to the channel now, because here, with each video, we delve deeper into the truth that liberates, the faith that reconnects, and the spirituality that restores your awareness of who you are. And leave your like now too, if this content made sense to you. This simple gesture helps this message reach other people who also need to awaken spiritually. And look, if you stayed this far, comment below, "I am part of the awakening," or write, "The truth found me." Comment with faith, with presence, with identity. Your comment is more than engagement, it's testimony. And before you leave, watch the next video that's appearing on the screen now. It is the direct continuation of that journey, and will take you even further into the truth that has been hidden from you. See you there. Shalom, Aksay, and may the Almighty guide you.